That works. So back to the Kosovo young lady. She said, I'm looking for a job, banking, and I want to be in business, and I don't know anybody, and I'm a waitress during the day, and I'm going to school at night trying to get my degree. So she gave me her resume, and even though she grew up in Kosovo and had a very tough time there, I learned later, she, again, it was a pretty plain, standard resume. Nothing jumped out at you. So, when nothing jumps out at you, when you like the person, an interviewer might say, well, tell me about yourself. Just ramble. And she said she grew up in a little village in Kosovo. Civil war was going on there. And she said her village was bombed and attacked. She had relatives killed and friends killed. And she said, my mother and I came to America. And I had, she said, my whole life in one suitcase. And it was kind of a chilling, still gives me kind of a chill. My whole life in one suitcase. And I said, go out, get a stamp pad, and get a red rubber stamp that says, my whole life in one suitcase. And stamp it on the top of the resume, and stamp it on the envelope that, or put it at the top of your resume if you're emailing or texting the resume out. And she got a job at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, which is like a lifetime assignment, and she could be there for the rest of her life. And what got her the job, the man who hired her said, it was your story about Kosovo and your intensity that got you the job. So start looking at things, your life, in a different way, and don't assume that your grades in school are going to do it. And think about what your hobbies might be, and something that's unusual, whether you collect things, you have a strong interest in. One young lady got a job because her hobby was tango dancing, and she danced a tango at various contests in big cities all over America, and that was much more interesting than any job that she's had. So I won't beat this theme to death, but again, it's how you brand yourself, and I don't care where you live, the same things apply, because the revolutions come and go, and I don't mean war on the streets. The printing press, the electric light, radio, television, movies, the automobile, the internet. So they roll on, but what never changes, if you take nothing away from this session, it's human nature never changes. And if any of you are interested in the stock market eventually, or go into markets, in my view, since all life is relationships, I think movements in markets, you get blah, 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 and you get headlines all over the place. Movement in markets, in my view, is mostly emotional, meaning fear and greed. Every time there's fear, you should be a buyer, not a seller, in almost all cases. And when people are greedy, like the internet bubble in 1999, 2000, everything that had a .com on it, companies went public, they had no sales, no earnings, no future, and popped way up. They all crashed and burned in 2000, with many of these internet startups going to zero. So I've worked through 5 panics in the stock market, where people called, clients called, and said, everything's going to hell, nothing's ever going to be good again, it's over, it's like our way of life over. So I worked through 5 real panics, of course, including in this century, 9/11, when everybody who called said, you've got to sell everything because our way of life is coming to an end. And then in the meltdown of 08, 09, which is the worst meltdown in stock markets or the economy since the worldwide depression in the 1930s. And in every single case where there was panic and fear, every single case, you should have bought things, not sold. And if you ever want to really make money for yourselves, every time it hurts in your belly, that it hurts so much I can't possibly think of buying anything, that's probably the best time to start buying. So, fear and greed dictates markets. I would say 80% it's fear and greed, and 20% is reality. One other headline that I think you should bear in mind is, don't be a headline reader. So what does this mean? We're assaulted by headlines every day, no matter what form of device we use, or read, or take information from. And if you know, this concept of don't be a headline reader came to me maybe 30 years ago. I had a client who ran a think tank in Pittsburgh, and it was mainly with the Defense Department in Washington. And I asked him if he had read such and such in the Wall Street Journal. And he said, I haven't read a newspaper in 15 years. This was a time when everybody read newspapers every day. He said, I haven't read a newspaper in 15 years. I said, how can you not read a newspaper? You're partly in the media business, and you have to be informed. How can you not read papers? He said, because 15 years ago, I knew all about two subjects. All about two subjects. He said, every time I read about those two subjects in the press, they always got it wrong. So I figured, if they get wrong what I know about, what about what I don't know about? And he said, if I don't read papers, it'll save me 2 hours a day. And so everything you see splashed in the headlines, whether it's revolt or bad economy in your various businesses around the world, and what your families are doing in various areas, and they know what the truth is. But the headlines and the coverage in news, there is a lot of fake news, no matter whether you're on the left or the right or in the middle. And if you know the real story behind the news, I'll tell you a kind of a chilling story. Has anybody here ever seen the movies Taken? Kind of adventure movies? Well, with Liam Neeson, one of the Taken movies is his daughter's in Paris, and she gets kidnapped with a girlfriend by basically sex slavers to kidnap these girls and put them basically into sex slavery and have them disappear. So in the press over the weekend, a very small article about a woman who was missing a young woman who was missing for a couple of days, went to a bar in Boston and left the bar, and because of surveillance cameras, they caught a guy on camera leading this young woman away, and nobody could find her. So after various searches, because of the surveillance cameras, they found a guy who lived, I think, in Charlestown, and he had special locks on his door. And the real story, when you know the backstory, is that she was drugged in one of the bars near Quincy Market and taken away by basically 3 guys. 2 of them were Uber drivers, and she was taken to this apartment in Charlestown and totally out of it. And one guy was tracked down because of surveillance. They found him, and his 2 accomplices, one of them is still at large, but essentially, this was essentially like the movie Taken. There was this gang who had done this before, that they basically kidnapped vulnerable young women, drug them in a bar, and make them disappear. And I haven't seen anything in the press about this, no further story, but it's a chilling story about, better be careful if you're young and single, and about who you spend time with. And to think that this goes on in Boston. Most people who are respectable and think this doesn't happen in real life, all the places, almost all that you guys come from, you have heard of and seen or seen horrifying things that the average person wandering the streets in America has no idea about. So, just a sidebar about, think about what may be behind the headlines, and try and be an individual thinker for yourself. Do your homework, another headline for me. I usually talk for about 45 minutes or so and then do a Q&A because I'm sure that you guys have lots of questions. So just to give you the time frame. Does that sound good, Bob? Okay. Do your homework. If you're going to, and this is just a no-brainer, but it's amazing how many people don't do it. If you're going to go interview with anybody, whoever you're going to see, Google them. And it's incredible how people can be flattered if you know something about them. And they will be so flattered that you say something indicating that you have a clue about who they are, whether it's a professor of yours. In other words, the more personal you make the interactions you have, the more it will accrue to you in a good way. If you all go out for dinner, say that you're all new students here, and 6 of you or 8 of you all go out to dinner where it's not on campus, it's in a restaurant someplace. To really find out about the character of the other people, there are things that are really character tellers. And that is, if I go to a dinner party, and I did on Saturday night in Boston in the Back Bay, and there were 10 people at dinner, and 5 of them I really didn't have any idea about. So after the main course, I said, how about, I clinked on a glass and said, how about we go around the table and everybody tells a story. And what I'd like you to all contribute to is, we all tell, what's the most embarrassing moment of your life, if you can tell it? What's the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to you? And when people tell the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to them, it kind of bonds the people who are there. And it makes you sympathetic toward them, or you're amused by them. And instead of wondering, if you leave a party of 10 people and you really didn't get to know 6 of them, this is the best way to really understand people pretty quickly. Or, one other thing, with older people, go around the room and everybody say what their first job was ever. And I play this game with billionaires. And it's really interesting where everybody started in life, because where we all start, we sure are not going to finish there. Getting appointments with doctors, this is another subject, or appointments with lawyers. And I find, again, being personal, so if you send somebody an email, or particularly emails, I get several hundred emails a day on 2 sites. I have a site as a writer, and if anybody punches johnDspooner.com, I have a cartoon website, and it's interactive. So if you go to johnDspooner.com, and there's a bow tie hanging from a coat rack, and if you click on the bow tie, it opens up an article I wrote for the Atlantic Monthly years ago. What's the history of the bow tie? What kind of weird people wear them? And any stories about bow ties. It's amazing, how many people are interested in kind of obscure things. But you can punch on anything throughout the cartoon, and it leads you to other things, articles and stuff like that. So it's a further branding opportunity. When I send somebody an email who doesn't really know me, I always put in what I call a provocative heading. So if I put in, there was a song years ago, a romantic song, love song really, from years and years ago, from before I was born. And the song was called You and the Night and the Music. So occasionally I'll put in the heading, You and the Night and the Music. And because it's a little different, people are not going to blow by it. Everybody's going to be curious enough to open that up, and then you make your pitch. And years ago, it was always difficult to get doctor's appointments. And I'd call a doctor's office, say it's a dermatologist. And dermatologists, I don't know why, very tough to get appointments with dermatologists. So if you call today, and it's in January, and the office may say, well, we can see you April 25th. This is inexcusable. We want to get in there tomorrow, right? So for a long time, I'd call a doctor's office, and there'd always be a receptionist, kind of a gatekeeper, to keep you out. And the receptionist would say, well, what's the nature of your call? And I would say, I'm calling about the doctor's emotional future. And there's always a pause at the end of the line. And I could see the thought process, the click, 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 click. And the receptionist is thinking, it's probably the doctor's psychiatrist. And I better put him through. So I get through, and in almost every case, the doctor would answer. And I tell them the story. They'd laugh, and they'd say, we'll see you at 1 o'clock tomorrow. So little tricks of the trade, if you will, to solve certain frustrations you might have. So one family thing, before you all head out for your naps and lunch, is that one thing I really believe in, you all come from strong families. Get your elders' stories. Get the stories of your families, your grandparents and great-grandparents if you can. And because when you're your age, nobody thinks about, grandma's great stories and recipes. You just don't think about it. And you get to a point in life where you wish you had found out, who are you? Where do you come from? And in America today, it's almost like you can't define relationships. They're all over the law. I find young people are desperate for some kind of grounding, if you will, in tales of the past. So while your forebears, well, people are still around, parents, grandparents, perhaps even great-grandparents, one or two, get their stories, because they're stories that you will carry for the rest of your lives. And don't look back and say, I should have asked my grandfather about when they went to school, or if they ever went abroad, or special things in their lives. I had one grandfather who lived to be 94. He was an immigrant to America, and he ended up playing semi-professional baseball. I have a picture of him in 1907 in a catcher's uniform on Boston Common. He was also a prize fighter. And immigrant kids who were tough in the early ghettos when they came to America. And he was a tough kid, and his friends were tough. And he boxed, and he ended up boxing professionally. And at one point, these kids would be rounded up in the community, in the tough streets that they lived in. And if they were boxers, they'd be taken to the Charles River. And my grandfather was taken to a barge on the Charles River, where the people who ruled Boston, the Yankee class, they were in black tie and tuxedos, and these ghetto kids would fight each other while men in tuxedos were smoking cigars and drinking champagne. And these stories are priceless, and you've got them all in the backgrounds of your family. Get the stories. So, I'm going to end with just about entrepreneurship. If any of you are going to go out into the world and be entrepreneurs, I have somebody in my life I call the boy genius. And he lives in Tokyo now. And he and his family. But he's been a serial entrepreneur. He went to Harvard. He graduated summa. And he won a Marshall Scholarship to Cambridge in England. And he thought at the end of the 90s that globalization was really going to be a fact. So he said, corporations are going to need translation of annual reports and all kinds of documents. And he started a company called Harvard Translations because he could find translators in Cambridge. And he sold it to a public software company 10 years after he started it for a lot of money. Then he went to New York and he started a branding company that had a translation base, sold it to another public company, and took off with the money for selling his second public company. Then took the family to Paris, and he's now in Japan, and he and his wife have two little girls. And they're rather intense. It's an intense family. The two girls, who are now 7 and 9, won the ice skating